Hello, everybody. My name is Jonas, and welcome to another episode of MCL Talks, where we sit as a forum and discuss aspects with regards to the creative process in music. With me are the original members, the pioneer members of the Manila Composers Lab, led by Dominic Quejada, who is now working at Egosoft GmbH in Germany. Then we have also Juro Feliz, who is based in Canada. I'll talk about Juro Feliz in a bit. He's today's speaker. That's why I'm taking his place as moderator. Then we have Feliz Makahis, who is based in Austria at the Kunstuniversität Graz, finishing her PhD, her Doctor Arbeit. And then we have Alexander John Villanueva of the University of the Philippines College of Music. We have Marie Louise Calvero, who is a lecturer at the Hochschule für Musik in Freiburg. And then, of course, we have our coordinator, Pauline Arejola, who will be here with us through the process, who has also coordinated many aspects of the activities of the MCL through this lockdown. I would also like to greet a few people. I think it would be interesting to note that while we are doing this MCL Talks, we are also having the virtual Manila Composers Lab, who is being directed by Feliz Makahis and Alexander John Villanueva and AJ Villanueva. And of course, we have 5 young composers who I'd like to greet. They've been following us. Karen Alcabasa of the Philippines, Anak Baiharn of Thailand, Hilmi Ridha Mahardika of Indonesia, Jelal Koai of Malaysia, Joan Tan of Singapore. And of course, I'd like to greet also the guest artist for the Manila Composers Lab virtual version, or the VMCL, Mr. Max Reefer, who's a constant follower of the series. I also like to greet Pak Dieter Mack, composer based in Germany. He's a German composer, but I believe spent more than half of his life in Indonesia. He's an expert gamelan performer as he is a composer. So today's speaker is Juro Feliz, and he will talk about a very interesting work for trio, for viola, cello, and contrabass. Well, just a brief bio. This Toronto-based composer and writer collaborated with artists including Liminar, Thin Edge New Music Collective, Continuum Contemporary Music, and Ensemble XY. He completed composition studies at the University of the Philippines under, of course, me. He then studied at McGill University under Melissa Hui. He also had mentorship from artists including composers Lisa Lim, Dieter Mack, Linda Caitlin Smith, and Japanese koto performer Hiroko Nagai in various occasions. Since receiving the Goethe Institute Southeast Asian Young Composer Award in 2009, he received premieres of his work in programs including the Mata Festival, NIF North Summer Festival, Muslav Festival, Music Biennale, Zagreb, Yogyakarta Contemporary Music Festival, and Asian Composers League festivals. Apart from releasing music under Ablaze Records, he has produced and co-hosted the radio talk show Sigaw ng Bayan at CKUT 90.3 FM Montreal. He also currently produces the article/podcast miniseries Nomadic Sound Worlds under the Canadian Music Center Library Residency. And we are very happy to have Joachim here to talk about this piece for trio. I give the floor to Joachim. Good evening or good morning in your case.
Good morning. It's morning right here in Toronto right now. So I think it's very appropriate actually to delve into the work itself. So the name of the work is Kanyang Paglayag, which I'm going to present today. And you're going to hear an excerpt for now. So I'm going to talk about sa Kanyang Paglayag. And this is a 10-year-old work. I composed this in 2010. And there were lots of things happening during the time. And before I delve into the history of its creation, I'm just going to describe it for a little while here. So it's a 13 to 15-minute work. It's a quite a significant, work for viola, cello, and contrabass. And the title itself, Sa Kanyang Paglayag, means in his voyage. So it's in Tagalog, by the way. And this comes as part of a series depicting iterations of the phrase Sa Kanyang. So in Tagalog, it's really just like referring to someone in terms of ownership and all that. And I completed this in 2010, probably before or after I attended a summer course in Darmstadt. And I remember having it premiered in the Yogyakarta Contemporary Music Festival months after its completion. So the performers who premiered the work are namely Dwi Ari Lamlan, Dwi Pahangana Pratala, Dwi Pahangana Prabawa. And it had also performances in Taipei in 2011 and in London with the Ensemble X.Y in 2016, into which recording you actually heard right now. And this work delves into the notion of imagery, and there's lots of investment in articulating imageries of darkness, desolation, disintegration, and the affect that comes with that. It just emerges in various forms of their articulation. And at the same time, I was in the formative stages of like exploring the notion of spatiality in my works during this time. So space in music, not only in terms of musical sound, but also expanding dimensions towards the extra musical as well. So I'll talk about the history leading to the creation of this work. And I think it's very vital to go all the way back and trace the influences and my mindsets. It was really composed at a time during my formative years as a composer. It started all in 2008. And if you actually remember Friendster and Multiply, they're like the Facebook of that time. So there are heated interactions in social media at the time that I got involved with. And it kind of revealed the ignorance on this perceived culture of apathy among the classical music community in the university at the time. So I was an undergraduate at this time in the University of the Philippines. And maybe some of you will actually remember this time too. There were a series of events that led me to discover the use of silence as a discursive element in music, and the act of being silent or the act of silencing. There are two opposing ideas here, but I kind of discovered that the act of being silent is the articulation of deep unrest. And this highlighted the micro sound worlds that could potentially embody a whole universe upon close inspection. So it's like having the phrase "still waters run deep," so to speak. And so many works actually came out from this idea. Sa Kanyang Pananahimik for choir, I composed it during this time. And also even Sa Kanyang Pangungulila for choir and orchestra, I got it premiered at the university, sorry, not at the university, but at the Cultural Center of the Philippines. And it led on to one of the first Manila Composers Lab projects where we collaborated with visual artists. This was in 2008, all the way to 2009, I think. And so with these collaborations, I collaborated with a visual artist who depicted the horizon, the image of the horizon as a polyptych. As a polyptych. We see 5 panels that she actually painted, just literally depicting the horizon line, and there's an image of a hand in the middle of it. So that's how I remember the visual work at that time. And from that collaboration, Sa Kanyang Paglingon emerged, which eventually won the Goethe Southeast Asian Young Composer Award in Kuala Lumpur at the time. That creation of the work got me to thinking of moment form, allowing the use of silence as a unifying thread. So again, I was dealing with silences. And also now comes the consciousness of actually conjuring moments of oral events. But not only that, I also delved into exploring the ensemble dynamic, so to speak, where each individual person is actually cueing the other. So you see agency here as an organic totality. And I remember discussing my work sa Kanyang Paglayag at the time in Kuala Lumpur, because the theme was actually all about the urban city. And I remember saying that I depict the urban city as a form of collective action, right? So it's like each individual is actually contributing towards a totality. And of course, the totality is also still somehow greater than that. And that was 2009 in Kuala Lumpur. From there, I composed The Visions of the Horizon, a musical drama. And the horizon line never left me, so to speak. It really haunted me throughout those times. Imagining the horizon line being a form of, uh, it's a schema, so to speak, that kind of depicted a sense of hopelessness, a sense of distance for me. It's like there were personal events also that happened during the time that revealed this idea of the other, where no matter how much you traverse the distance between you and the other, it's like there's a certain impossibility of just like reaching that certain goal. And the horizon line for me was like the depiction of that. It's like you're trying to reach the horizon line, and it's like, no, you will never actually reach that point. So it's just like trying to chase the end of the rainbow, so to speak, right? Trying to find the gold and the leprechauns and all that. So this is when the Visions of the Horizon came about. And the main influence also in the creation of that work was Kaya Sariaho's L'amour de loin, the opera, the first opera she made. And I remember watching it in 2007, 2008, and I was so mesmerized with this depiction of distance and also the depiction of the other and the fatal journey towards the other. Where, if you know the story, where Geoffrey Rudel actually traversed the ocean eventually to reach his distant love, only to actually meet death, right? And so personal experiences of estrangement and detachment, this led me to think about boundaries, like setting boundaries, and also the performative aspect of setting those boundaries. Me thinking about the self versus the community, the inner world versus the outside reality. And that thread of thought led me to the book of Ecclesiastes in the Christian Bible, where it's the meaninglessness of life is actually depicted. And so, in collaborating with the librettist Phoebe Biton, I composed this musical drama. And so this is where Sa Kanyang Paglayag actually emerges out of. So with the idea of silences, with this idea of desolation, with ruminations of the other, me and the other. It's a certain form of othering in a sense. Like it's a process of othering where I recognize that this is me and this is the other, and the journey towards actually traversing that depicts a certain possibility. So, in a nutshell, that is the history of its creation, and I would probably have to play another excerpt of this to make more sense out of the piece. So I'm gonna talk about sa Kanyang Paglayag and the musical elements involved here. First thing would be the structure itself, right? The form of it. I see moment form here as the articulations of departure. It's the oscillation here between sound and silence. It's like coming from like needing to actually make something sound out towards something that needs to be silent, probably even suppressed or just hidden. It's like trying to like create a veil and all that. So it's the oscillation of this kind of action that I find very peculiar for this piece. Another thing to talk about more probably would be the sustained action and the sustained sound and the notion of continuity in this aspect, where it's not only about sustaining the tones themselves, but it's also the kinetic energy involved in repeating cells, where we see what Maceda would call probably droning. And also on counting the rests as well. And the rests here are very intentional. This is not something that someone could just easily like stop and just wait for time to pass by. In fact, the expectation in depicting these rests is that um, you're actually counting. The musicians are counting the rests. They're counting the beats so that they could actually cue the other, right? And also that this process of cueing structural points, passing down the downbeats. This is what you would also find in Stockhausen's work Gruppen, for example. And there's also the temporal and spatial dilation as well happening here. You see increasing permeations of silences. This is where silence allows the space for imagining a micro sound worlds. It's just like trying to make things fade in and then fade out and then fade in again, fade out or something. And at the same time, while it could be comforting for some, silence also now comes as discomfort. And some would even argue maybe silence could also be oppression. I would even propose that silence, that's the silence, that the object that is, it's actually a privileging. Many people actually desire silence, but there are many other situations where silence is actually a commodity, so to speak, right? So there's a certain class issue happening here, where many people do not have access to silent spaces, and the act of actually highlighting this is kind of like privileging that. There's another aspect of vocal articulation as well. So if you actually heard the excerpt with the musicians spouting out explosive consonants, all of those things, they come in for textural effect. And at the same time, there's this aspect of textual material, because if you go on with the piece, you will eventually hear the Tagalog word gising. And gising literally means to wake up, or it's like prodding someone to wake up from this reality, wake up from this darkness, so to speak. And that kind of narrative element is already found in my previous work, Visions of the Horizon. Finally, there's also the resulting intertextuality involved here, right? Because it's not that sa Kanyang Paglayag can only exist in itself. It actually is part of a certain world. And I come to this process of worlding, where I'm actually creating worlds. As a composer, I'm depicting a universe where sa Kanyang Paglayag is only one entity involved in this whole universe. And it's also interesting to note the depictions of affect and various trajectories coming from the experience of silences and space and all that. And probably to end this talk, I kind of find it very peculiar that I'm talking about this 10-year-old work right now, because true to its nature, it probably symbolizes an eventual departure, I would say. um, it's it's me, or the work is probably symbolizing me departing Southeast Asia, moving here to Canada. It's a departure from the homeland. At the same time, it's also a departure from silence as a discursive element, because I don't compose like that nowadays, for example. Yeah, it's actually just funny because like I kind of like left it all behind now once I actually moved here. And it's a departure from communities, and it's also a departure from past lives. And I probably should end my talk on that note. So I think the floor should be open up for discussions, comments, whatever.
Oh, thank you. It's a very, very interesting composition. It's the before I get in my real comment slash question. So you have sa kanyang paglayag, sa kanyang paglingon, sa kanyang what else? This is a 10-year-old question, which was running in my mind when you were my student, and eventually you went on your way and grew up. And who is Kanya there? Is that you, or is it some person? Is it who exactly is this Kanya? Is this a kind of reflexivity that is in another person, or I'm just curious. Because if you would look at all those sa kanya, sa kanya, sa kanya series of yours, or product line, let's call it, something connects them somehow, and maybe it's not musical. It's not like a piece with a common melody or something. No, it's not that so shallow. No, it's something deep. So, is there? Can we know who this sa kanya, who this kanya is?
Yeah, it's very interesting that the kanya in Tagalog is very gender neutral. And I really love the fact, the ambiguity involved there. It could be anyone. It could be him, it could be her. And in fact, I depicted this ambiguity in the translations, in the English translations of those titles. Sa Kanyang
Yeah.
Paglayag is translated as in his voyage, right? Sa Kanyang
Mm-mm.
Paglingon is in her glances. So like all these
Wow.
oscillations between like depicting other persons, it's actually a process
Yeah.
of othering, I would say. This process of
Oh.
othering, like projecting on other
A
and
process, a process of othering. Yeah, yeah. I think you stumbled there with your audio. A process of othering, right? I'd like to clarify that for our listeners. Yeah.
yes, and at the same time, it's like the motivations of this authoring is probably, now looking back, actually, it's probably just also a process of projection, because again, remembering Italo Calvino and his Invisible Cities, so where
Yeah.
Marco was, like narrating all these his adventures in dystopian cities and all that. His depiction of
Yeah.
these dystopian and utopian cities that he saw was actually just like his projections of his hometown Venice. And I would say it's like the
Yeah.
projection of myself in this aspect, because I
Yeah.
probably have been talking about myself as well. So here comes the idea of building a universe now, because this is
Yeah.
basically me being iterated in so many forms and so many in so many forms and iterations.
Before I proceed to my real comment, this brand of reflexivity, which is actually let's call it transforming. It's not exact. It's liminal in that sense. Huh? In that sense, in between. In that sense. Any comment or question from anybody?
Um, it's very remotely connected to the Kanya concept.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Juro Kim mentioned that he had this notion of individuals contributing to a totality. And
Mm,
he also mentioned sa kanyang paglayag springing from a conflict with individuals contributing to a totality. How do you
mm.
reconcile those two things? Or is that even a problem worth considering?
Well, looking back and also looking at where I am at this point, I still find it irreconcilable at this point, actually. There's this distance that prevents me from seeing how these worlds, or how the self and how the others actually can organically mesh into one cohesive process, I would say.
Yeah.
Because you could always talk about self-interests. You could also always talk about community interests, the interests of the nation state, or whatever you want to, whatever you want to actually talk about. And I find many clashes, and probably this is also why I conceived sa kanyang paglayag, in the sense, and relating it again to the meaninglessness of life in the book of Ecclesiastes, is also just because I find it all meaningless at the end of the day, or I found it all meaningless at that time. There's this kind of irreconcilability. Like at the end of the day, what can we do about it? It's not like I can suddenly have this breakthrough where I suddenly understand the other, or the other
Mm.
will understand me. But at the same time, I also find it probably biographical too, in the sense that in my personal experience, I still do not feel that organic connection somehow. It's like my interests are always opposed to the interests of others and vice versa. Even though sometimes you just have to like make sense out of it or try to negotiate through all of that.
My real first question, that's not a question, it's in between what a question and a comment is. It's just, I just regret the fact that because of the length of the piece, it's 16 minutes, but it's not I'm not complaining about it. It's exactly how long as it should be. It's such a very good piece actually, and very impressive piece. And I just regret the fact that because we could listen to it as a whole, okay, we do not experience the silences as they were actually intended to be experienced. The first time I heard this was 10 years ago, right? No, I did not hear this performance. I heard the one in Yogya. Anyway, um, I thought that progression, in fact, that made the whole thing for me. I mean, that progression into that first silence, that was the most effective thing. In fact, it actually redefines silence. Is the way you express it. Silence as an oppression, silence as a deep unrest, an unsettling thing. Okay, it actually creates this kind of dead air. There's 1 minute of silence at the first general pause there. From that point, I wanted to go backwards. From that first silence, it reminded me so much of one piece I wrote, from which we called the sound clip for our MCL logo made by Pauline Arejola and John Owen Castro. This work called Aguyoy, where it's just little seconds of sound, and then there's this very very long progressive silence. And again, I'm thrilled by that idea because it actually revises what I would consider as a faux pas on the part of John Cage when he created this, which to me is a big joke. This 4 minutes and 33 seconds. To me, that was a joke. I mean, it was, of course, not with all respects to John Cage, he had other intentions, but here silence is used, in fact, as an element of music.
Going through the piece, you will hear more of them coming, emerging and coming,
Yes.
and all that. And actually, honestly, like when I listen to this myself, I feel exhausted. It actually is an exhausting work for me to listen to, and probably even experience it itself. Right? I've never been in the subsequent performances except just for the premiere. But I remember the premiere, it's very unsettling. Even though I think that we could have stretched the silences all the more in the premiere, it's like there's this heavy air. It's like you're experiencing this blanket, this heavy blanket of air that you just like want to just like push away actually. And in that sense, yeah, silence actually is like it's like a unit of sound in itself, so to speak. So we are materializing silence in this way. It's not silence only as a default absence of sound. In fact, I would not even call silence as absence in this case, but it's presence. In fact, it's actually present. Silence is present. It's something that is in front of you. It's something that is a result of not of actually removing something, but of actually inserting something. And so this is why I find the notion of silence very helpful actually in coming up with schemas that actually help this piece, the intentions of this piece.
I want to comment. I was just trying to think about this in my own perspective, and I thought about our discussion 2 weeks ago about syntax, and initially I thought of the silences could be the punctuation. And Juro, you said that while listening to it, you were exhausted. And I don't know, maybe just to try to simplify my way of thinking, if the syntax of the whole thing seems to be very fluid. So let's take into consideration maybe the silences are the punctuations. So basically just words or lines just sprout out of those silences and then go back to those silences. The entirety of the whole work is the completion of the whole syntax, I think. It doesn't really make sense if we just listen to 2 minutes of the whole work, because that's not the whole thing. That's not the whole. You can describe it all you want, but I was also thinking about how the collective action. There are passages that allow some sort of freedom for the musicians to cue each other and to move the music forward. But in your thinking of the piece, it is that sort of thing that repels you. Is that right? Yeah, maybe you can talk about that aspect of the music, how that negates your way of thinking and how you created the piece, or
So yes, talking about like the ensemble dynamic, my intentions of doing this in the musical sense, that is actually also just to like break away from using the notion of meter, like, because when we talk about meter, like you actually have to synchronize. You have this idea of synchronizing iterations of time, depicting them in fixed groupings of beats and all that. And I kind of wanted to get rid of that because it's specifically this process of highlighting the individual agency of each of the performers of each of the whole ensemble, that I kind of like wanted them to create their own passage of time and leading others along with that. And it's like, yes, I do realize that there are some tensions. There's actually this opposition in terms of thinking that you want to individualize or individuate something and expect a cohesive whole, totality as a result of that. Again, I am still in the middle of negotiating all of this myself in my current compositional praxis, actually. And but then again, yes, many musicians actually have commented on this sort of ensemble dynamic, because I've gone on to explore more about it, even trying to do this with 6 performers. I'm not sure if I actually extended more than that, and even actually grouping these 6 performers in 2 groups and trying to come up with a mechanism that they could actually cue each other, right? So imagine groups actually cueing each other, even probably without a conductor, and that's very very challenging.
That's very nice. If you reminds me of one of Spallinger's pieces called it's from Baudelaire, Fugitive Beauty. There are 6 performers and they're grouped into 2. Anyway, silence is as important as the musical material you heard itself, because silence is made into a material. It is transformed, and this natural progression towards this silence is very important. It's not just that there is silence there, but it's this progression. It's that's the thing in music. There's this seamless flow, and actually it becomes music in that sense, into this silence, and that silence is in itself becoming a material. Any other comments regarding this?
I liked how the pauses were different. How it's a recurring object, but it changes in character each time, where objectively it is the same thing that comes back, but possibly because of what happens before and after and in between, it isn't the same thing whenever it comes back. I really like that. But I do have a question about this notion of silence. It's a non-existent concept, isn't it? I mean, the visual equivalent is black, which is the absence of light. But because of how we sense sound, we don't know what the absence of sound is like. I mean, I've been in a completely black room where all of the sounds were dampened and I could still hear stuff. could you say something about that? I mean, about your concept of silence and silence being this almost utopic concept that doesn't really exist.
So John Cage actually also wrote something about his experience in being in an anechoic chamber, actually, and it's exactly what he said. Silence is not existent. It's actually like when you go there, and when sound is intentionally suppressed at like 0 decibels, you actually still hear something. You hear your heartbeat, you hear the nervous system working, and all that. So this is why I do not. Depict silence again as absence, and I already mentioned this a while ago. It's actually presence. And even when you listen to 433 or whatever 433 is at this point, right? Like if you actually intentionally like go through it, you'll actually hear lots of different things. And this is where the micro sound worlds, the concept of micro sound worlds already like come in play. So it's not like you magnify something that's supposedly that doesn't have nothing, and you'll not find anything. In fact, you'll find something, right, and all that. So it's really just like magnifying probably all of these sound worlds and probably the thought process, and the progression of progression towards the silences. Actually, I also find that interesting in the sense that at the certain latter parts of the piece, I was actually playing around with whether this is silence or this is not silence. So Jonas was actually talking about liminality in this sense. So like in the in-betweens, there's actually this menomoso part where everything is actually just played at the pianissimo level, or pianissimo. I think it's triple P, yeah, the triple P level. And it's as if it wasn't there. And so, yeah, so there is also that negotiation, and probably also just like playing around with what silence is and what it is not, so yeah, it exists as an abstract concept, but it's never a reality, so to speak.
I also want to comment. There's so much you can say about silence, and I'm itching to to make this comment about something very similar. In the piano ensemble, we performed a piece way back 2016 by Melita Cruz, and in the piece there were silences, there were fermatas and whatever, different kinds of fermatas, rests where there are no fermatas, just rests. And I'm going to speak as a performer. Professor Johannes Schulhorn, he was at the same time, as it is a competition for the young composers, it's also a workshop for the ensemble. And to me, as the conductor, so he taught me maybe 10 different ways on how to conduct the silences. And I just thought that it's so related to this piece of yours. I just imagined those silences. And yeah, they can be non-existent, just replying to Kuya Nick's comment. But in performance, we are taught to hold the silences differently. And it's amazing to think of silences in a compositional standpoint that way, and in a performance standpoint in this way.
I actually think that in
Yes.
silence there is more energy than any other part of the piece. So for me, silences always propel my next action or my next set of sounds. Or yeah.
What would be a visual counterpart to that? Dominic was talking about blackness. Can you do that in film? At certain portions, there's going to be darkness where there's nothing happening, or there's something tense happening, or I remember. Well, this is not because of the film, but because of our black and white television in the 70s in Los Baños. There was this certain, I forgot the movie, where all of a sudden I don't see anything in the screen because our TV is so low tech, and but it was dark, but they were supposed to be in a certain cave. That's what I remember. I think it's Journey to the Center of the Earth. I think that was, and I was so tense because I don't see anything happening, but I can hear something, kaluskos, little sounds, this is there an equivalent to the visual stimulus?
I think there are different ways to depict silence in film. So I'm not a film expert, I just compose for film, but in my observations, there are, for example, the example that you stated, that they went into a cave and there was suddenly no light, and it gives more tension to the scene. There are also silences where I saw in works of other students where the two characters are just sitting across one another and they are not speaking. And in the context of the film, you know that there's supposed to be a problem and that they're not speaking to each other. It's adding tension again. I think there are many ways.
Maybe we can go back to the image that Boggs, the Juro, has, like the focus of the piece or the pieces, and it's the horizon. And for example, when I'm traveling and I see the horizon, I would remember Boggs, and it's something, it's vast and spacious, and there's nothing that stops you from looking at it except when you blink. And maybe it's, I don't know if Boggs will agree with this, this kind of interruption, or I see the silence more as the vision, and the interruption or the punctuation as the thing that happens to you when you're looking at it.
It's something that's really just like out there in the open, and it's really upon the listener, or it's upon the performer or the receiver's agency to actually like recognize it, right? So it's just like seeing the horizon horizon line where for the most part, because we live in cities, we live in places and in topographies where we don't actually see the horizon line. It's like it's really just a matter of like imagining that it is actually there. And then now when the silences come in, this is actually the moment where we actually put it in the foreground. Suddenly, like we recognize that, oh yes.
And speaking of recognizing, so when in the piece, when you're approaching the silence or what's actually happening in the moment, there are two dimensions that I've noticed in like how you approached silence in the moment. So you have the materials and it's dissolving into nothingness. And the other one is that there's this ambiguity and it progresses into clarity. And when you say clarity, it's more of maybe the meaning of the piece, the whole meaning of the piece, when you wanted to emphasize this, for example, the gazing, or or being silenced, or so I wanted to ask if you could comment on this. And then the other one is the other question is how do you plan, or how do you compose maybe the bigger structure of this kind of this piece when you have all these moments? And do you plan an overall structure, or does it just emerge while you're working on the details? Or yeah.
Okay, I'll probably try to tie them all together as well, because I also just like looked it up. We were also previously talking about like the visual counterpart of silences, right? And obviously like black comes into mind, and it's very interesting to actually know that in physics, black is actually the process of absorbing all the colors, and none of them is reflected back. That's why we see black, right? So black is actually not an empty color, so to speak. It's actually like the presence of all colors. Like all of them are being absorbed, and none is actually reflected back. And so this progression towards absorbing all of these elements and all that, I would say yes. The progression is about dissolution in this case, where everything is like being frayed. In terms of structure, I relied on the notion of dilation, because if you actually listen to the whole piece and look at the score, you'll see increasing numbers of moments where silences are occurring, and they actually stretch in time. They stretch over in time, and sometimes they even permeate the ones that where sound supposedly exists, like you count the rests and all that, if you're actually counting the rests. And I, structural wise, I demarcated certain structural points. General pause lasting for 60 seconds or 40 seconds or 20 seconds. And it's actually interesting to explore that notion of like, even when the general pause themselves are actually like decreasing over time from 60 to 40 to 20, this tension of actually increasing those moments of general pause also kind of like pulls that apart, so to speak. So structure wise, I was envisioning that. And yes, was my way of exploring space as being stretched out, right? So this imagery again of like the horizon line being stretched out like a rubber band, so to speak.
If we may circle back to the notion of agency, this is a question that, to be quite honest, I've always been mortified that people would ask me about my work, and haha, no one did, because I have no answer for it. We always use these devices and say that it is to explore agency in the part of the performers. And in your case, you mentioned that the concrete device was the lack of meter. But you also mentioned, and this is very real, especially when there is no meter and there is no conductor, the performers tend to be very, very concentrated on the beats, precisely because they have no meter to guide them. So given this, isn't the agency illusory?
Oh, because they're being guided by an invincible frame.
Because they actually have to concentrate on that structural device, which their normal training, oh god, now I fumble. Which the meter is the device which their training tells them makes it effortless, and we take that away. And so they have to concentrate on time when doing this. And so isn't that agency illusory in that case?
I think it's gonna be a two-way street at this point, right? So you relegate the interpretation of something to someone, and that's when they actually that's the framework that they're actually acting on. I probably have explored this in later works where I allowed the performers to choose the speed of counting themselves. So, but that's only like another layer being added onto that specific framework. So it's very interesting now to hear that thought of actually like that agency is illusory. I don't have an answer. Maybe yes, maybe no. Who knows? I'm gonna be like that for now. Yeah, but other people could also have thoughts about agency anyway, and it's probably just like having this dilemma. Like when you talk about freedom, are you really free? For example, right? It's like when we talk about freedom, people here in North America really emphasize the Second Amendment and all that. But what has this so-called freedom got us into? What has what has the Second Amendment actually got the Americans into now that they're actually like tackling many issues in terms of social issues like gun control and all of these things? So yeah, so what is freedom? So I would probably also just like throw that around. So we probably can't even define what agency is in a very concrete sense in terms of this piece. That is, like, is it the performers wanting to actually count the beats, or is it that they just want to depict the silence as something that they just like stop by and all and let time flow in itself? So there are many probably trajectories in which you can actually try philosophizing, or so to speak, about depicting these agency, what this agency is.
Very good. Very good question. Very good answer in that sense. My next statement has to do with in a way agency. I'll try to segue to that next question / statement. But before that, if now since we're talking of agency, in my experience in agency, and this has to do with my fascination for jazz performed by the likes of Chick Corea or Brad Mehldau, where you actually hear them more than the material they're playing. The more rigid, and this also has to do with my experience with oral traditions. The Iraya Mangyan, the Bagobo in Mindanao, the Kankanaay in the north of the Philippines, or those people. In performing, let's say, vocal music. Uh, in my experience, especially in that kind of in those kinds of traditions, and also with of course I would always cite Patangis Buaya because it harks on uh, that kind of performance mode. And in oral traditions, I can say that the more rigid the framework, on the other hand, the freer the more liberated the performer is. The performer becomes more liberated because his framework is very rigid. It's the same as our knowledge of grammatical principles when we're talking. The more rigid the grammar is, the freer we are to express. And this will rely not only on the rigidity of the grammar, but also on our skill of utilizing this grammar for our own ends. So I think agency would have been into that way by which grammar is manipulated by the practitioner. So you talk of musical grammars as well. The other thing I'd like to from where I would segue into is your notion of form, your agency as a composer here, Juro Kim. Are you aware of that? I mean, of course, nobody is really aware of that of one's agency. The fact that it's a process of negotiating between rigid principles and one's own volition. But with regards to form, Juro Kim, I was listening over and over to the first part because I was fascinated with what was the first silence, and I was listening over and over. And you know what? It's like a sonata allegro in a positive sense, okay? In the sense that I could feel, and this went on with constant listening. When did you send this to us? Like a few days ago, and I kept listening to it because I'd like to study it before talking about it. And I feel a kind of introduction, which leads to this part where you have the repeat signs, which I'd like to call in gigantic quotation marks as a theme, and then the Durchführung, the passage that follows that, which reminds you a bit of that material and the introduction in the first page, goes into a passage that leads into the second theme, which is the silence. Can you comment on that observation?
Yes, I was actually aware about the structure of the sound moments themselves, right? There's this idea of an arc, so to speak. And I will always come to a point where everything has to be droned out, to be repeated. And again, this is probably my way of also just exploring like how the cyclical form can actually be used as a discursive material. And you will find, especially before the general pause, like everything is dissolving into this fatalistic, I would say, this fatalistic cycle of just like going through. And probably in my mind at the time, this was my way of depicting the traversion, right? Like traversing distances. This is like me trying to propel something forward, which ironically is expressed by means of just like cycling through, going through a circle. So yeah, you could call it also you could call it like the resolution of a certain of a certain sound moment. So yeah, so I was very much aware about doing that. It appears a lot in the first before the first general pause and also the second general pause, and everything actually like dissolves from there.
Which leads me to another point, Juro Kim. in the first episode of this MCL Talks, Dieter was commenting about my notion of narrative, and one very important thing I remember in his comment. You can read them. You can read the comments there. Okay? Is that he talks about narrative. One is my narrative, my personal narrative. He was talking about, he was saying this in reference to the Tagulaylay, and which talks about my narrative, which apart from that, the music, which has its own narrative. And apparently, I was struck by that very important comment of Dieter, in that sense, with regards to the music itself having its own narrative, the music itself having its own life. It's our reflexivity actually goes only to that point. When we start writing music, it is music. It's the music. It has its own life. It's that I think is that I think is where we could see this thing about sublation, where the notion of being music. I should really think about how to say this, not like this, but in a way, what I want to say is the notion of this reflexive aspect of your life, of your philosophy, of your thinking, of what you want to depict, is your narrative. But when you put it into music, it becomes its own narrative. The music itself has its own narrative. It is significant because the music itself is its own production. So people will appreciate the musicness of this piece of music without being very much aware of your own narrative. This is true for everybody, because I already see the reflexivity, which apparently is very strong in us. But when we listen to the music is very strong in itself. And that actually reminds me also of another piece I wrote. It's called Aufhebung, which is similarly, in a sense, also, after I compose, also I realize it's like a sonata allegro.
Yes, I've read the comments of Dieter actually, and I'm also like struck by that kind of insight that was being pushed out there too, where we could think of the reality of the composer and the reality of the music itself, and those are two distinct spaces. But I see composition and the praxis actually of composing as more of in terms of worlding. And for those who don't know what worlding is, it's actually an emerging discourse among new materialism, and Helen Palmer and Vicky Hunter actually defined it as something like a particular blending of the material and the semiotic that removes the boundaries between the subject and the environment. So in this case, I see worlding happening here, in which the composition itself, the work, the boundaries of the work, and the boundary of the reality of the composer, the composition and the composer, they're already becoming blurred in itself, in that there emerges another third entity, actually a third world, so to speak. And the process of worlding is actually articulating that, and it highlights the process of becoming. So it's like when I compose something, this is the composition will exist, my world exists, but at the same time there's more than just like the sum of that. And in that sense, like I'm building like there's this notion of the building of a world surrounding. This is why I'm also I'm like going further from just like thinking about them as dualities, like this space of the composition, the space of the composer, where in fact like we could also think of them as another totality, especially when you see time and space progress here. If you look at the compositions of this composition and this composition and this composition, and this is where I actually find the Kanyang series very helpful and very informative, because here I'm actually building a world. I was building a world at the time, and I probably will want to continue building that world, even if it extends towards what my reality is and what the compositions themselves are. I remember Frank Herbert's Dune. if people are into sci-fi. This Dune series, it started as a novel and then it became a trilogy and then it became a saga, just like the Lord of the Rings, for example. And in each work, like there is a very vast universe being depicted on them. And then in the next work, there's also another world being introduced. And so like there's the totality of these worlds that I think really just like blurs out like these boundaries.
I mean, it completely is worlds within worlds within worlds, especially in our case. You think of, you have this thoughtscape. I don't know what to call it. You have this idea in your head of what a piece of music is going to be before you start writing it, and that transforms as you write it. And then you have to negotiate with performers. And that's the end of your control, trying to transmit that world to the performers during rehearsal and hoping that they get it, and then they perform it, and that's something completely different. I remember something Dita used to say about when we'd have defense, sometimes when we'd argue our music. This for viewers, this is how composers work. We make work and then we attack each other, essentially. And this is how we learn. And he used to say, well, maybe that's what you thought, but that's not what you wrote, or that's not what you made. And in a very real sense, what you're thinking is different from what the performers actually create, which is different from what the audience actually receives. And sometimes this differs from audience member to audience member. Sometimes this differs from performance to performance. And I guess we can say that each of those things are different worlds in a sense. One question though, if I view a piece that was written and was performed in a particular way, and I receive it in a particular way, so that is my personal world with that piece, how valid is that given how distant it might be from what the composer originally conceived?
That's probably one of the features of thinking about space now, right? Because the space that the composer resides in and the space that this performance resides in, they're all pretty much like valid. And specifically also like the space that the listener, the receiver actually inhabits on, that's also very valid. I would actually argue that everything could be valid. And this is where we already realize that this the spatial aspect of musical performance. So when we talk about space, it's really not just about sound objects. You're thinking about pitch, you're thinking about time. You know, it's like this XY coordinates. Actually, there are more dimensions in spatiality in music, even beyond physical spatialization, where you actually like disperse performers in physical space and all that, because there's even the social aspect too. This I don't have the vocabulary for this yet, but there's this social spatiality where obviously like social factors also affect the way that the performance is received, and these topographies, these various topographies of these spaces, like it really just like highlights the fact that musical performance and music making is in fact very spatial.
I can think of one word: perception, and maybe thinking about space as well. Concert goers who might have listened to this work, for example, has a different or comes in the concert hall having this different space in their mind, and I just wonder how how the composer, for example, can reconcile all those spaces. For example, there's this space in the mind of the conductor, this space in the mind of the instrumentalists. How as composers, how do we reconcile those spaces? Or
Um,
is it even important to reconcile those spaces?
I just want to make a certain comment with regards to the mode of production and the political economy of performance spaces in this so-called neoliberal capitalist world we are living right now. There's a big difference in terms of exchange value of composers as a commodity, and his music, of course, no? Being performed in Darmstadt than just being performed in Manila, being performed in New York City, being performed in Paris. And the other question is being performed by Ensemble Recherche, being performed by Trio Catch, being performed by Wild Up in California, being performed by Ensemble Modern or Ensemble Intercontemporain. There is an exchange value not only for the music but the composer. And in this so-called neoliberal capitalist system, and I think the best icon we can think about that system we are living in now is to look at Spotify, where everything can be represented. I'm not saying everything is represented at the moment, but everything can be represented and everything can be marketable. And to acquire space there is also another kind of prestige and another kind of exchange value. That is the model of this world. So we have a following for new music. This work was performed in London by performers from London and excellently. And both has to do with the very good way it was written. At the same time, by the way you use the technical language, so to say, the schema for composition, which is part of this general, broad, rather fluid language of new music in the dominating world of the Euro-American continents. And apparently, we see the music of Lachenmann, of Spalinger, being sold in Spotify. Of course, it will not compare with how much Lady Gaga's music earns, but it has a market. It survives a market. And sometimes I feel that the market is ideally kept small and rare because that kind of rarity also adds exchange value to the commodity. Di ba? There's this elitist ears for Neue Musik. And I guess this is what the world we are living in now. So we will survive. We have a market. We just have to understand that if we want to thrive in Europe, and I think you guys are, you will have to contend with the requirements for acquiring that exchange value. My mission is different because I'm still I'm like a Maceda idealist in that sense that I'd like to create exchange value for a music that is cultivated here in Southeast Asia, which can be marketed abroad. But first and foremost trajectory is not only the discourse but the praxis of what we call contemporary in Asia, because our modernity, even if it's homogenized with what is happening in Europe, I mean, it's at one point, if you're coming from an airport and you're lying down, you're riding a super highway, you don't know the big difference between this super highway in Frankfurt or the super highway in Singapore or the super highway maybe even in Manila. Of course, not in Manila. You wouldn't know the difference so much because the homogeneous structure and the homogeneous culture and the homogeneous notion of building and creating is already permeating into the consciousness of those developing. I'm sorry I had to bring you guys into this discourse of political economy. Because I just wanted to make you realize that they are very important as composers, and I think Dominic feels this very well.
I'd just like to answer AJ's question about whether it's possible to reconcile all of these worlds. It is. It's doable. By very tightly composing the piece such that there's a very limited number of ways in which you can interpret it, and very tightly controlling the performance and very tightly controlling every single production such that the context is very, very clear. And I've done it, and I won't tell you which piece it was. But to be honest, it's not worth it, I think, because you miss the universe of worlds that can come out of music. And I did it once and I never did it again because I want those questions. I want those questioning faces in the audience. I want that universe essentially of worlds to emerge. And after I did it that once, I decided that I would much prefer to pose questions and listen for answers and questions and answers to those questions.
Just responding to Dominic's comment, I think it's also this fascination that I'm really invested in. I just want to see the worlds emerge, so to speak. And for me, it's not even seeking questions and answers. Like, yes, we can always pose questions, we can always seek answers, but for me, it's just also like letting it all unfold organically and seeing the result of that process, which and that's for me the most fascinating thing. And I've seen that here in my practice, where this kind of thinking and ensemble agency, for example, when I bring it to other musicians in the first place, like some of them have to negotiate, like how should we attack this chord, how should we actually rehearse this piece and all of that. And there are many ways in which they actually emerge, they actually traverse that difficulty. And so yeah, as a composer, I'm just like, I'm gonna sit down here, relax, and let everyone figure it out for themselves.
I think we covered so much ground, and we're actually evolving, all of us, through the process. This is our fourth. Uh, we will temporarily stop here. Thank you very much, Juro Kim, for all your insights, which I'm sure not only us have learned, others have learned also from this. And thank you very much for all your comments, everybody. Goodbye. See you again in the next episode.
you.